In one way, it seems like this class has been like a long period of time, but at the same time, it feels like it's gone by really quickly. I don't know if it's because it's after church and not in the middle of the week like we normally do, but it's been a really good time to gather together and to just engage in this question: is the Bible reliable? This is a question that my wife and I encounter oftentimes in our Bible schools, in the mission that we work with, Youth with a Mission. And we thought it would be a great topic to kind of cover here at Reality Honolulu. Whether or not you have been a Christian for maybe like a short period of time or a long period of time, this question about the reliability of Scripture is hugely significant for the life of the believer. And a lot of the questions that we've addressed so far in the past 3 weeks are questions that you may have had. They may be questions that a friend of yours or a family member of yours had. Maybe they're questions that you now have, but it's important that we don't hide from difficult topics, but we actually engage in them. 2 weeks ago when I talked about the reliability of the New Testament, I said a quote from Dr. Daniel Wallace that says, now I'm forgetting it. I'll remember it. Hang on. Faith without reason is not a reasonable faith, and it's not a Christian faith. And so for us as Christians, when we say that we have faith in Jesus, it's not baseless. It's not without fact or reason or logic or history. We actually have a lot of things that we base our faith in. And we base it in history. We base it in reason. And those are things that we can actually be quite confident in. And so hopefully this class has been informing for you. It's been hopefully encouraging to your faith. And hopefully it's not just equipping you in your own personal life, but there's going to be people in your life that God brings into that maybe have doubts about the Bible and about history. And we need to be able to actually communicate clearly and effectively why we believe what we believe. It's not enough to say like, hey, great question, look it up on YouTube, right? But we need to be informed, and that's part of our job here. So we're really excited to kind of finish off this. And if you haven't been with us and you haven't watched any of the videos online, they have been recorded. So I encourage you guys to check those out later in the week if you want to kind of catch up to where we are this morning. And two questions that we kind of have been addressing in this category of reliability has to do with, is the Bible textually reliable? And we spent the first 2 weeks talking about the text of the Old Testament and then the text of the New Testament, showing why we can be confident that what we have today is what we had then. 2,000 years ago or so, when the authors originally wrote the New Testament, we can be absolutely confident that we have the actual words that they wrote. And the second question that Abby kind of started us off with last week is the Bible historically reliable? So cool that we have the words, but is what they're actually communicating true? That's kind of important. And Abby introduced us to the area and the study of archaeology last week, and she kind of showed us 10 different examples of how history and archaeology has kind of shown us and illuminated several passages, several stories in the Old Testament, and how it shows that it is actually reliable. The events and the people that they describe were real people and real places at real times in history. And this morning we are going to finish off by looking at a little bit at the New Testament. And as I was preparing this, I was kind of in my mind, I was like, well, there's a lot of stuff in the New Testament we can talk about. And what I want to focus on specifically is having to do with the person of Jesus. Because really, that's what the New Testament is about. The four Gospels are all biographies, histories of the life of Jesus. And then everything else in the New Testament just is talking about Jesus. It all has to do with Jesus. And if Jesus wasn't a real historical person, we're in big trouble. And so we're going to talk about that this morning, the person of Jesus. We try to help not only in this class, but also point you guys to some resources for further study. I mentioned this 2 weeks ago. Great book by Dr. William Mounce called Why I Trust the Bible. It's a great resource if you want to know more. And then Abby mentioned this guy, Dr. Titus Kennedy, who's an archaeologist and historian. He has a few different books, but this book in particular that I used in my preparation is called Excavating the Evidence for Jesus. And he just goes through a lot of different discoveries that they found that help illuminate the history of Jesus in the Gospels. And so some of the information, actually most of the information that I'm communicating comes from these sources. So thanks to those guys for doing all that hard work. So the question that we're going to be talking about is pointed to evidence for the historical Jesus. Evidence for the historical Jesus. And you may have not even thought about this before, but a question that comes up quite often if you're talking with someone who's an atheist or an agnostic, or maybe somebody who's just is of a different faith, they may say something like, was Jesus an actual real person? Or was he just a myth that early Christians created? I don't know if you've ever thought of that question or someone's ever asked you that question. Because we're 2,000 years removed from the time period of Jesus. So how in the world are we supposed to know that he was a real historical person? And while it's not necessarily that common in scholarly circles to discuss this question, I'm going to talk about that at the end, it is quite popular to talk about this on places like TikTok or YouTube, where unfortunately most people get their information. And people will just say things like, did you know that Jesus was a myth? He was completely made up. It was a fabrication. We know that. There's no historical evidence or proof for Jesus. And you're watching these videos and you're like, what? What in the world are these people talking about? That should always be your question if you're watching a YouTube video or TikTok video. Do these people actually know what they're saying? Because people will say it like it's fact. And so what we need to do is we need to take what people are saying and dialogue with it. We need to reason with it. We need to understand, is what they're saying true or is it not? And if you are debating or doubting the historicity of the person of Jesus, this is called, people have kind of referred to this idea as Jesus mythicism. It's a hard word to say. And there's several books that have kind of popularized this idea. One is from this book called Jesus, Neither God Nor Man, The Case for a Mythical Jesus by Earl, how do you say that last name? Daughtery, I don't know. Sorry. And this is what he says about this. He says, it's the theory that no historical Jesus worthy of the name existed. That Christianity began with a belief in a spiritual, mythical figure, that the Gospels are essentially allegory and fiction, and that no single identifiable person lay at the root of the Galilean preaching tradition. That's a pretty serious assessment. I mean, we've just been spending the past few months talking about the miracles of Jesus with the assumption that those are real events, that they're real people, right? But there's plenty of people that would argue and debate that. I was watching, I don't know how this happened, but I saw a clip of Bill Maher on YouTube or something like that, and he said this about the Gospels and about Jesus. He says, quote, that they are obviously ancient myth, like it's just fact. And there's a lot of people that like Bill Maher and watch Bill Maher and think that he knows what he's talking about, and he just says, it's obviously an ancient myth. Why in the world is he saying that, and is that true? And the way we're going to address this question, I kind of have 4 criteria that I want to go through. And I got these criteria from a video that I was watching from Dr. Mike Lincona, who's a New Testament scholar, historian, and associate professor of theology at Houston Baptist University. And he says that it doesn't matter if you're talking about like New Testament scholarship and history, if you're just talking about history in general, there's criteria that people use in order to establish whether or not it is true history, right? And we're going to do that when it comes to Jesus. And these are the 4 criteria that he mentioned. The first is, do you have multiple independent sources? Multiple independent sources. The more sources you have, the stronger the evidence will be. Makes sense, right? So multiple independent sources. The second criteria is, are any of those sources unsympathetic? Unsympathetic. And we're going to see that. We're going to see historical sources that talk about the historical person of Jesus that were very anti-Jesus and anti-Christianity. Those are great sources. The Gospels, on the other hand, are great sources, but they are very sympathetic to Jesus, right? That's the whole point of what they're writing. So if we only had the Gospels, you kind of be like, is what they're actually saying true? But if you have unsympathetic sources, those are fantastic. The third criteria is early sources. So how early were these people writing about this particular person, this place, or this event, right? The earlier, the better. That makes sense for us, right? The earlier, the better. The less history that's taken place between the actual events and the person writing it, the more the chances are that it's going to be historically reliable and accurate. And then the fourth is eyewitness, firsthand sources. And of course, we're going to end with the 4 Gospels that are firsthand accounts. If you have somebody writing about an event that they witnessed themselves, that is the best proof, right? If Abby was to tell you guys, a few months ago we were at the Kaneohe sandbars and we saw, I don't know if they call it a school of manta rays. And we were like, do manta rays go into Kaneohe Bay? I don't know. And if you were listening to Abby say that and she said David saw them, you might be like, let me ask David did he actually see those things, right? You want to know what the person that was there saw. And the 4 Gospels are actual eyewitness accounts of that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to work our way through these 4 things rather briefly. And I should say that this is not an exhaustive list. I've just picked things that I think are the most significant and the easier ones to communicate. There's other that some of those books actually refer to as well. So again, we're going to use these 4 criteria in trying to establish whether or not Jesus was an actual historical figure or whether he was just myth, as some like to propose. And so we're going to start with multiple independent sources. So besides the gospel accounts and besides the letters that Paul wrote talking about Jesus, etc., what other historical accounts do we have that discuss the person of Jesus? Now, it's important for us to also note, because we might not quite understand, that Jesus was a rather insignificant person in history as far as a historical person goes, right? He was just a Jewish guy that people thought he was a good teacher, right, in ancient Judea. As far as a Roman world perspective, that was so far removed from anything significant happening. So we don't have, you shouldn't expect a large amount of material based off of some random person. If you're talking about Caesar Augustus, someone like that, you expect a lot of material. Alexander the Great, etc. But what we're going to find is we actually have a ton about this person, Jesus. And the source that we're going to talk about right now are independent sources, mostly Greek and Roman authors, and then one Jewish guy named Josephus that we're going to start with. Sorry, some of these quotes are long, but I didn't want to kind of like cut and paste them. I want you to actually see them and then have access to them later. So Josephus, if you don't know who Josephus was a first century Roman and Jewish historian. He was a Jewish man, and he was famous for writing several very large histories, the Jewish War, antiquities, etc. We know a lot of information about the first century because of Josephus. Josephus is a Jewish man. He's not a Christian. And although he wrote about a lot of different things in Roman history, there's two places in particular that he actually mentions the person of Jesus. There's two places. I should mention that this one right here is a little bit debated because scholars believe, and this is a different version than the original version. It's an edited one, which I'm going to explain. This version, people, if you go to the original one, scholars say it's been edited later by Christians because Josephus mentions this person, Jesus, and he says he was the Messiah. And we know Josephus was not a Christian, and he would never say that. But most of the quote, scholars believe, is actually what he said, and this is a reflection of that from a scholarly perspective. So this is the edited version that actually communicates what he originally said. And this is what Josephus said, right? Somebody who lived shortly after Jesus, a generation after Jesus, and was writing in that place and at that time. He says this, "At that time there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah." So that's part of what they say. Earlier, it says he was the Messiah, and they said, no, he said perhaps the Messiah. "Concerning whom the prophets have reported wonders, and the tribe of the Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day." So here we have a really quite reliable source very early on, an independent source, talking very specifically about the life of Jesus. It sounds like he's describing, doing a summary of the gospel, right? Here's the second place, and this quote in particular is not disputed by scholars. This is what they would say is actually 100% reliable and authentic. He says this, "Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James." James, the brother of Jesus, if you guys were with us, we did a series on James. This is the James that Josephus is referring to. So here we see another time where Josephus is talking about a historical person, the person of Jesus, an independent source from the New Testament, and it's a very reliable one as well. Here's another one by this guy whose name is Pliny the Younger. His name is Pliny the Younger is because there's a Pliny the Elder, right? Makes sense. And what he's doing here is that he was a lawyer and he was an author in ancient Rome. And there's about 247 letters that he wrote that have survived. And these are of great historical value. And some of them are addressing emperors or nobles and even historians like Tacitus, which we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. And this is what one of the letters that he wrote said. Again, this is probably end of the first century, right? So this is a generation or so removed from the life of Jesus. And this is what he says. "They were in the habit of meeting," he's talking about Christians, "on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternative verse a hymn to Christ," referring to Jesus, "as to a God." So here he's talking about this group of Christians who gather together, and what are they doing? They're worshiping and singing to Jesus as if he was a God. So here we have Pliny the Younger, a Roman, writing about this historical person of Jesus, specifically about his followers. I got all these pictures off online. These are just obviously artist depictions of these people. This guy is, his name is Mara bar Serapion. I practiced that. And this guy was a Stoic philosopher from the Roman province of Syria. So this is right around where Jesus lived. And he was writing probably first or second century, some think maybe a little bit later. And he's writing to his son. And it actually contains an early non-Christian reference to the crucifixion of Jesus. And this is what he wrote to his son. He says this: "What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these three wise men." He's talking about two other people and Jesus. "The Jews, ruined and driven from their land, live in complete dispersion. Nor did the wise king," again referring to the king of the Jews, "die for good. He lived on in the teachings which he had given them." Again, he's referring to who? He's referring to Jesus. And most of these authors are writing about Jesus' followers, right? These disciples, these people who claim that there is this man, Jesus, who died and rose again, and they now follow him. And so people are kind of a little bit confused. But here he's referencing this person of Jesus. Not only that, but that he was killed, right? They actually killed him. And again, we're thinking, oh yeah, that makes sense because the Gospels tell us that story. Here's the last one for this particular point. Again, we're talking about multiple independent sources here. Multiple independent sources. So this guy is named Lucian. And this is what he said. "He learned the wondrous lore of the Christians by associating with their priests and scribes in Palestina. They still worship the man who was crucified because he introduced this new cult into the world, denying the Greek gods and by worshiping that crucified sophist himself and living under his laws." So obviously this man is not sympathetic to Jesus and his followers, right? But he's referring to Jesus. And what does he say about Jesus? He says that he lived in that area and that he was crucified. And that his followers now worship him. Again, these are independent, non-Christian sources very early on, 1st and 2nd century, that are talking about the historical person of Jesus. Not just that he existed, but the fact that he lived, the fact that he was killed, and the fact that people still follow him to this day. Very early on in history. These are very significant. We're looking for multiple independent sources here. Those are just a few that I want to name. So the second thing we want to talk about is, now, again, most of those people are unsympathetic. Like Josephus was a Jew who obviously was not a Christian, so he was not unsympathetic. But what about people who were like really hostile to Christianity? What did they have to say about Jesus? And I have two for you. The first is Tacitus, who was a Roman historian. And historians talk about him that he was probably the greatest of all Roman historians. And he lived, right, end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century. And this is what Tacitus said. And again, this was a guy who was very hostile to Jesus and the Christian movement. He says this: "Hence, to suppress the rumor, he falsely charged with the guilt and punished with the most exquisite tortures the person commonly called Christians, who were hated for their enormities." So he's talking about the persecution of Christians. "Christus, the founder of the name, was put to death," he's talking about Jesus here, "was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius. But the pernicious superstition represented for a time broke out again, not only through Judea, where the mischief originated, but through the city of Rome also." So he's talking about how the Christian witness has spread all the way in Rome, and it's causing a lot of disruption. And he's not happy about that. But notice what he says about the person that started this. Christus, the founder, put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius. If you go to the Gospels and you go, which we're going to talk about later on when we get to Good Friday and Easter, it's going to mention Jesus being crucified by Pontius Pilate, right? So here we have not just an independent source, but a very unsympathetic source referring to the gospel story. That this person, Jesus, was not a myth, that he was a real historical figure that was really crucified. And people believe that so much so that the message has spread all the way to Rome in just a few decades, and it's causing a lot of problems. And that's why he's writing about this, right? And then the second one that I want to talk about, it's a little bit of a long quote, so again, I apologize. This is from this guy, Celsus, who, again, was not a fan. He was a Greek philosopher, and he was a very early opponent of Christianity. He has this massive literary work called The True Word, which is essentially just an argument against Christianity. And this is a quote from this by Origen, who was one of the early church fathers that was writing kind of to contradict his argument. And he has this massive quote in here, and this is what he says. For he represents him disputing with Jesus and confuting him as he thinks on many points. And in the first place, he accuses him of having, and this is where he's quoting this man. Celsus says that they invented his birth from a virgin and upbraids him with being born in a certain Jewish village of a poor woman of the country who gained her substance by spinning, and who was turned out of doors by her husband, a carpenter by trade, because she was convicted of adultery, that after being driven away by her husband and wandering about for a time, she disgracefully gave birth to Jesus, an illegitimate child, who, having hired himself out as a servant in Egypt on account of his poverty, and having there acquired some miraculous powers on which the Egyptians greatly prided themselves, returned to his own country, highly elated on account of them, and by means of these proclaimed himself a god. So this is Celsus' assessment of the story of Jesus. He believes that Jesus was a real person who had real powers, but where did those powers come from? They came from Egypt. Of course, he doesn't agree with what the New Testament authors, the gospel writers, say about Jesus, right? Look at what he says about his origins, about Mary and Joseph and those things. But we see this guy who's very hostile to Christianity talking about this person, Jesus, as a person who was literally, physically born in history. There's no doubt from ancient historians that they all believe this to be true. It's just not, you're not going to find that. What they don't agree with is what the gospel writers necessarily claimed about Jesus, right? Obviously, they're skeptical. They're Greek and Roman and Jewish historians. They have their own worldview, and they don't agree with the worldview that Christians are promoting, but they all agree that Jesus was a real historical person that existed in time. And if you were just to combine what we know from independent, unsympathetic sources, and you just pretended like the Gospels didn't even exist, this is what we would know about this person, Jesus. Here's a summary. We would know that, number one, that he lived. Number two, we would know that he was Jewish. He lived in the first third of the first century. People believed he had been born out of wedlock. We just saw that. Jesus' ministry overlapped with John's. Jesus worked wondrous feats. He gathered disciples. Jesus lived in conflict with the Jewish authorities. Jesus was described as a sorcerer who led Israel astray. Some believed him to be the Messiah. Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, believed to have been raised from the dead by his followers who worshiped him as a god, and his brother James was martyred in AD 62 by the high priest. This is without the gospel accounts. Just from history, this is what we know about this person, Jesus. And so the history, what we're finding is we're finding multiple independent, unsympathetic early sources. The best kind of evidence you could ever get for historians is unmatched when it comes to the person of Jesus in history. Like it's unmatched, it's unparalleled. So why do people say that? Why do people say that this person never existed? It's either one, that they're ignorant, or two, they have an agenda. And it's probably a little bit of both. But if you hear people say that and you come across those things, you don't need to be afraid. Actually, it's quite contrary to that. If you hear people say that, the more you research the argument, the more confident you will become. I promise you. Because our faith is based on history. It's based on a real historical person, the person of Jesus. It's not based in a myth. Right? We don't hide ourselves in a closet just hoping that what Pastor Riz said on Sunday morning is true, even though everybody else is saying it's not. We don't need to be afraid of that. We can actually know the truth. We can know facts. We can know history, and we can be confident in that, and not just confident for our own self, but actually be confident to actually explain that and to reason with our family and with our friends. And if you are one of those people in this room that has questions, that's great. The church should be a place where you can come and you can seek truth. right? And we can be confident that what the gospel writers are saying is actually truth. So we're going to look at a few more things. So besides multiple independent sources, which I previously mentioned, most of which come within the 1st or 2nd century, which is 100 years or less in the time when Jesus lived. We have early sources and first-hand sources. And what we're going to do now is we're going to talk just a little bit about the Gospels, because the Gospels are hugely significant when it comes to understanding the historical person of Jesus. And one video lecture that I was watching, I think it was Dr. Mark Lincomb, he said, if people say you can't use the Gospels as historical proof, he said, that's not a historical issue, that's a worldview issue. Because it's absolutely absurd to take the Gospels and just say we have to disregard them because of who wrote them and when they wrote them, right? That doesn't mean that historians don't say whether or not what they are claiming to be true is true. But New Testament historians very much take the Gospels into account when they're trying to recreate the historical Jesus, okay? And those are important. And we're going to talk about those things right now. So early sources, right? We already talked about some independent sources. But what about the Gospels? We have 4 Gospels that are stories about the life of Jesus. And this is just briefly going back to week number 2, just a little bit, because the Gospels are some of the earliest, most reliable first-hand accounts of the life of Jesus that we have. And here, this is for you, Uncle Les. Again, a little bit of a refresher. P52. Uncle Les likes to talk about the papyrus, so that's good. And P52 is the earliest manuscript that we have of the Gospel of John. And so the 4 Gospels, you guys, that we have in our Bibles were believed to have been written by eyewitness accounts, eyewitness apostles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew was a disciple of Jesus. John was a disciple of Jesus. Mark traditionally was written based off of Peter's witness, and Luke mentions in his introductory, in his prologue, that he is writing based off of eyewitness testimony. So the Gospels are not just great sources, but these are coming from people who actually were there, who followed Jesus, who witnessed these things, and that's why they're so incredibly significant. And they're not just significant because of that, but they are so early on, where within the first, the Gospel of John was thought to have been written about like 80 to 90 AD, traditionally believed to be. P52, which is a copy at least of the original autograph, if not a copy potentially, is dated to around 125, with one scholar dating it to within the 1st century itself, within decades of its original writing. And if you don't know the significance of that, you can go back and watch, I almost said episode 2, not episode 2, the second part when I talk about this, because this, along with the other Gospels, is almost unparalleled in other histories, right? It's so early on, and that's important for the reliability, right? If the Gospels are written like 400, 500, 600 years after the time of Jesus, we would be a lot more skeptical. But if they are written by people who were eyewitness accounts, eyewitness to the things of Jesus, and they wrote them very early on, they are extremely reliable. And you should know that if you're thinking about reading scholars, generally speaking, scholars try to date things as late as possible unless proven otherwise. So up until this was found, scholars, for the most part, especially critical scholars, dated the Gospel of John to late 2nd century. They're like, there's no way this was written any earlier than 2nd century. So 170, 180 AD. And so therefore, there's no way this was associated with the Apostle John, right? And then all of a sudden they find P52, and everything that was written about that theory is now thrown in the trash. Right, so that's just kind of how they operate, generally speaking. Let's date things as late as possible and until we're proven otherwise. I think Abby mentioned this, but a lot of the things that we're discovering, we've had access to forever, but it's just a matter of time before scholars can actually discover these things. So Dr. Daniel Wallace mentioned that they have over 1 million papyrus scraps that they found in Egypt. And less than, he said 1%, I think, but let's just say less than 10% of them have ever been published. They're pretty much just stored in museums. And it's almost the same thing with some of these historical things that we found. It's only up until recently that people have been excavating, and it takes so long. If you just watch how tedious they are digging up things, it's like there's so much yet to be discovered. But the Gospels are so early, and they're such an accurate eyewitness account that we need to take them seriously. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to spend the last 10 or 15 minutes talking about some of the archaeology that they find that kind of coincide with some of the stories in the Gospels, right? Because again, it's important that we know that what we have today is what we had then, okay? But when John is talking about, the pool of this certain pool that Jesus was at, was he actually accurate in that, or is he making up stuff? The Nazareth, the hometown of Jesus, did the gospel writers just make up this story, or is this actually real history? And I think for most of us, we just take it for granted. We're like, of course there's Nazareth there. We know that. But those are pretty recent discoveries. Most of these really key archaeological things are within the last 100 years for the most part. And Abby mentioned a little bit about how we should approach archaeology, and mentioned that less than 10% of things that are possibly to be discovered have been discovered, because there's a lot of people that still live in Israel, and you can't just kick them out of their house and bulldoze their house and dig under their house, right? So they're constantly dealing with those issues. Also, too, it's interesting that most of these places that are historically attributed to Jesus have some sort of church built on them. So the Byzantines in the 4th century just built churches, and then the Catholic Church did that too. So there's just churches built on everything. So you can't just say, hey, can we demolish this really old church so we can dig under here and see what's under here? You can't do that. So it gets a little bit complicated. But I want to talk about this house in Nazareth. From the looks of it, it's relatively insignificant. It's just some stones, right? And why is Nazareth significant? Well, in Matthew chapter 2, verse 23, it says this, and he went and lived, talking of Jesus, and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. And so this is significant because the gospel writer said that Jesus lived in this town, Nazareth. And this actually used to be a really big problem, because up until recently, there was no evidence that there was a first century village of Nazareth. There was no evidence of that. And so scholars would say, Matthew doesn't know what he's talking about. That's completely fabricated, that's made up. There was no first century village of Nazareth until recently. And they've discovered, when they started digging up some of these places, they discovered not only was there a village there, but it's dated to the 1st century. And not only that, but this house that they discovered was in fact a Jewish house. And that's based off of some of the pottery and some of the things that they've discovered there. And here's a quote that I want to read to you. It says, the discovery is of the utmost importance, since it reveals for the first time a house from the village of Nazareth, and thereby sheds light on the way of life at the time of Jesus. The building that we found is small and modest, and it most likely was typical of the dwellings in Nazareth in that period. From the few written sources that there are, we know that in the 1st century, Nazareth was a small Jewish village located inside a valley. And until this point, there was some tombs that they found, but no real evidence that there was an actual village. And then they find it, and they say, oh, maybe the gospel writers actually knew what they were talking about when they're describing these places. And again, for us, we read the story and we're like, why would they make that up? But if you don't have evidence for it, sometimes they say, hey, look, a lack of evidence proves that's untrue, which, again, is not a proper understanding of what archaeology is and what it's not. And now we talked about that last week. So this house in Nazareth is really significant to our understanding of the reliability of these eyewitness accounts. And that's kind of the last thing that we're talking about. Is what the Gospels are saying, is that actually true, real history? Was the person of Jesus real? How can we be sure that the Gospel writers actually witnessed these things and actually described things that they actually had seen? Here's another fun one. This is the pool of Bethesda, the pool of Bethesda. And this comes from the Gospel of John. In John chapter 5, verse 2 through 3, it says this: "Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed." And you read that and you're like, okay, cool. But notice what John says in his description. It has 5 roofed colonnades. And this was a problem for scholars and for historians, because they thought John was making this up because they didn't ever discover this pool with 5 colonnades. They thought John was literally just making this fact up. And if you've ever read John, there's a lot of metaphors and ways that he uses numbers, and they just thought, oh, this 5 thing, he's making this up. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And what's interesting, and that was dismissed as a unhistorical literary creation, John chapter 5, 2 through 3. And you're not going to be able to see it from this picture, but they had found this and had dug this pool of Bethesda. And what it revealed is that it was a rectangular pool with 2 basins, so it's kind of like 2 big pools separated by a wall. And so, although it's not like the exact same, right? It's been, for the most part, destroyed. What they noticed is that it has 5 walls, and they have recreated most likely what it looks like, or what it did look like. And as you can see, there's 5. There's the right wall, the back wall, the left wall, the front wall, and the wall in the middle. 5 porticos, 5 porches where people would gather at this pool. It's the exact same as John described it. And up until recently, you guys, people said he's making that fact up. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And then lo and behold, what do they discover? Not only is that a real pool, but it's exactly, or was exactly, the way John described. So John is, in fact, a reliable historian. He's actually describing real people and real places at real times. Here's another one that I like as well. It's called the Theodotus inscription. The Theodotus inscription. And this is actually an artifact that is related to the story that Abby taught a few weeks ago in the Gospel of John chapter 9. And this is when Jesus healed the blind man born blind. He was born blind from birth. You remember that story? And it's taking place in this area of Siloam in Jerusalem. And one of the issues was that his parents, because of the controversy, got kicked out of the synagogue. I don't know if Abby actually read the rest of John chapter 9, but if you go back and read it, the story kind of continues. I think it's like 40-something verses, which is why Abby didn't spend 2.5 hours, 3 hours on Sunday morning teaching through it. But after the man is healed by Jesus, there's a lot of controversy, and his parents are actually kicked out, and he's kicked out of the synagogue. The problem was, for historians, was that they were like, okay, the story's fine, but there is no proof that there was a synagogue in Jerusalem in the first century. And they actually had a lot of issues with how often the synagogues were referred to in the Gospels, because there was just so little evidence that there was that many synagogues. And so they discredited this story. There is no proof that there was a first century synagogue in Jerusalem that is described by this story. And that's a huge part of the story. So in John chapter 9, verse 22, it says, "His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue." The synagogue was like the place of hearing the word of God. It was a place of community, right? This was very significant to a Jewish person in the first century. It'd be like getting kicked out of church, right? And what's interesting about this is that this inscription is the earliest known inscription from a synagogue. It was found in December of 1913, and I'm not going to pronounce it, but it was in an area known as the City of David in Jerusalem. And it was actually found in a water cistern, and it was 10 lines. It's an inscription of 10 lines. And essentially, all this inscription is, not all that it is, but it's describing the construction of this particular synagogue. And it goes into detail about this synagogue, that a synagogue was built and a guest room was built, talking about these different chambers and things like that. And this inscription, you guys, is the first archaeological evidence for the synagogue in Jerusalem prior to 70 AD, the very first. And so for a long time, scholars just dismissed this story. They dismissed the gospel writers as not understanding history, as uneducated writers. And the more we discover, the more it seems that it's verifying the validity and the legitimacy of the Gospels. So much so down to the very details. And I mentioned this before because scholars had a lot of issues with the Gospel's reference to synagogues, especially synagogues that existed in the first century. We see a lot more exist post-70 AD, but early first century, there wasn't a lot of information on these synagogues. And so not only was this validating that this story is communicating something truthful or accurate about history, but it was found in the same area that the story took place, right? It's not some inscription found in like Galilee or something like that. It's found in the very area where this synagogue most likely was. This is just a picture for you guys of a synagogue in Capernaum. And you can see on the left-hand side, it's this beautiful white marble synagogue. That synagogue is dated to the 4th century. But if you look on the far right-hand side, underneath the white stone, there's this small black basalt stone foundation, which is dated to the 1st century. And so here's another example of, oh yeah, wait a minute, we do have evidence. We do have archaeology that points to the stories as being truthful and accurate, right? The accounts of the gospel writers, the eyewitness account writers are describing, we find evidence that these are real places. And this is probably like the most famous site even outside of Jerusalem to this day, is the synagogue at Capernaum. I wanted to actually, I want to go back to the pool of Bethesda really quick because I think it's the pool of Bethesda or the pool in Siloam. I can't remember which one, because there's also a pool described in Siloam. And Abby mentioned this last week too, that a lot of times you can't dig up things that you want to dig up. And there's this video that I watched that Logos Bible put on talking about some of these discoveries. And this guy is at the pool of Siloam, and he's describing how there's these stairs, and you can see the stairs. And he's like, here's the first third of the pool. And then he says, well, here's where it ends because this is someone's private property. This is like a vineyard, and we can't dig up the other 2/3 of the pool. So that's what we're dealing with here, right? So it's like we found part of it, but it would be cool if we could dig it up, but it's like as of right now, somebody owns that, and they're not cool with people just digging up their property, right? So who knows what else we can possibly discover, but they're constantly finding new amazing things. And the last one I want to point out to is this. This one's a little bit hard to explain, but this was, it's called the tombstone. I'm really bad at reading. Of Q. Emilius Secundus. Let's just go with that. It's also hard when you have to try to like really read it. It's easy when you're like studying it and you just read it. It's like, okay, whatever. But then now I'm like, I got to say it right. It's really hard. Also, too, I realized that I constantly am touching the microphone when I watch myself in the videos. Hopefully, you're not noticing that. But it's like always falling off my face. I don't know. I think it's designed for Pastor Riz's head. But this is the last one I want to talk about. And this one's actually kind of a fun one. Because in the Gospel of Luke chapter 2, verse 1 through 3, it says this: in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be registered, each to his own town. And this has been a problem for historians. This description of a decree coming from Caesar Augustus, a census that took place when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Up until recently, they were like, there's no evidence of that taking place. Luke is kind of off here. And historians knew and know from records that Emperor Augustus had issued actually 3 of these in his history. And there was one in the 8th century, in 8 BC. Jesus is believed to have been born around 4 to 5 BC. So we know that there was a census taken right before his birth. And by the time that decree probably would have made its way down to Judea, it probably would have been right around the time where Jesus was about to be born. And so that's not the issue, but Quirinius being the governor of Syria who helped facilitate this is the part that was debated until recently. And this discovery is still a little bit debated, but Dr. Titus in his book talks about this. And you can see some of his videos online of why he believes that this is confirming this. And this is a Latin description found in Syria, which is the area of Judea. So Syria was a province in which Judea was under during this time period. And it talks about a census that was ordered during the time of Augustus and how Quirinius is the one that was in charge in this particular region, and he was a commander of a Roman legate. And this is really cool because, again, sometimes historians and sometimes scholars like to discredit the validity and legitimacy of the gospel writers. They're like, okay, they were like fishermen, they were like a tax collector. Like, what do these people know about anything? And again, the more we discover, the more it seems to indicate that they were describing real events in real times in real history, talking about a real person, the person of Jesus. And it doesn't matter if you go to multiple independent sources or you go to sources that were very unsympathetic to the cause of Christ, or you go to the early eyewitness accounts, time and time again, it's undisputed that the person of Jesus existed in history. And we can be confident in that. And I kind of mentioned in the very beginning, and we're going to end with this, that it's not so much a big discussion in scholarship. It's a very popular discussion in kind of like pop culture, which is where most people get their information from, right? Most people don't get their information from like New Testament or historians because nobody can read their stuff. It's very boring. Like nobody's going to read that stuff, right? We get our stuff from TikTok, 8-second video, 30-second video, whatever. That's where people are getting their information from. And people say whatever they want to say as if it's gospel truth on there. And it's unfortunate. Because I mentioned Dr. Mike Lincomb, and he said, that's this argument about the historicity of Jesus is not really a conversation in the scholarly world. Again, we're talking about scholars that are atheists, agnostics, and Christians. He says it's almost like a scientist talking to a flat earther. If any of you is a flat earther, I apologize. It's like it's so absurd. It's like that's not even worthy of our time. That's again what scholars believe about the person of Jesus. There's no debate that Jesus was a real historical person. There's debate maybe about the claims made about him, obviously, right? Was Jesus actually the Son of God who died and rose again? And I like quotes, so here's our friend Bart Ehrman. Remember I mentioned him in week number 2. He wrote a book called Did Jesus Exist? The Historical Argument for Jesus of Nazareth. Again, Bart Ehrman, he at one time was an evangelical, but is no longer. He's either agnostic or atheist. He says this, I do not discuss mythicists in the class, since I have repeatedly indicated, since the mythicist view does not have a foothold or even a toehold amongst modern critical scholars of the Bible. We're talking about modern critical scholars, non-Christian scholars. He's like, they don't even bother with that because it's so absurd. Here's one from Maurice Casey, who wrote a book called Jesus, Evidence and Arguments, or Mythicist Myths. He says this, I therefore conclude that the mythicist arguments are completely spurious from beginning to end. They have been mainly put forward by incompetent and unqualified people. The mythicist view, therefore, should be regarded as verifiably false from beginning to end. Again, these are scholars that are not Christian scholars. And here's the last one, just for fun. This is from this man, R. Joseph Hoffman, in his book, I don't know if this is from his book, but he wrote this book, Sources for the Jesus Tradition. He says this. This is his words, not mine. The disease that these buggers spread is ignorance disguised as common sense. They are the single greatest threat next to fundamentalism to the calm and considered academic study of religion. While there is some very light chance that Jesus did not exist, the evidence that he existed is sufficiently and accumulatively strong enough to defeat those doubts. And so just as we conclude, when it comes to the historical reliability of the Gospels in particular and the person of Jesus, we can be sure and confident without a shadow of a doubt that he was a real historical person, that he really lived. And we don't need to be afraid of what we see online, right? We need to be aware of it. We need to be able to reason with people. We need to be able to reason ourselves. We need to know what people are actually saying about these things so we can have confidence in our faith. If Jesus was not a real historical person, then we are to be most pitied because that's at the very foundation of our faith. We believe that Jesus was a real historical person, right? And so we can be confident in that. We know through this class that not only are the Old and New Testament texts reliable, we can be confident that what we had then is what we have today. And not only that, but we can be confident that what they are talking about, the times and the events and the people, were real people in real places at real times. I think that's pretty cool. Just preparing for these classes has been an extremely long amounts of hours, but it has very much encouraged me and built up my faith, and hopefully it has been for you. Thanks, guys, for joining us for these classes and just paying attention and hanging out. It's been an amazing time together. I'm just going to pray, and then we will be done. Father, we're just so thankful for the gift of your word, Lord. And we just thank you, God, that we don't have to be people that have this kind of faith that just says, I believe because I believe. But we can be reasonable people, that we can have faith and reason, and to know that the Christian faith is one of reason. God, and that we can be confident in your word, in the reliability of your word, in which we base our entire existence and in our entire lives. God, it's our prayer that the conversations that we hear or we discover online don't discourage us, God, but would encourage us to better understand our faith, better understand the historical value of our faith, to be able to be confident in what we believe, and not just for our own self. God, there's so many people out there in our world that need to hear the truth. God, that need to be have somebody who's a Christian that can communicate clearly and effectively the reason why we believe what we believe. Because it's true and it's historical and it's based in fact and reason. We thank you for that, God. We thank you that you allow us to engage not just our heart but in our minds as well. Just pray a blessing upon each and every one of us, God, and would you be glorified in everything we say and do. In Jesus' name, amen.